Let's continue again in Terry Eagleton's Ideology, Chapter 7, Discourse and Ideology. I left off on the last video with a little bit of this closure view of discourse analysis. I want to say a few more things about it here. Now, remember, for Eagleton, this discourse view of, this closure view of discourse analysis, he says it's, around in the 70s. So he's writing in the late 80s, early 90s with this book. So he's, maybe close to 20 years ago, but now quite a few years ago. It was a kind of this closure view, and it's that closure is something bad. Was quite popular in the 70s in the Tel Queue, which is a French journal. Now, there's a lot of subtleties going on in Eagleton's argument, but discussion, that is, of this closure view. But basically it says that ideology really is the fixing of dominant signifiers, the vehicles that have meaning, right? The signs, of an otherwise free field. Like, just there's tons of these signifiers, tons of signs in the world, and they're kind of free and open. They can generate meanings in all kinds of ways, and there's all different kinds. But once you start fixating on closing off and saying, well, some of them don't have meaning or not acceptable meanings, some are privileged meaning generators, etc., etc., that's becoming an ideology, because you're prioritizing some of the signs, and maybe going so far as to trying to eradicate, delegitimate all other kinds of signs, and control the way, basically, that the sign system is working. So an otherwise free and open one, you're trying to put some brakes on it and control it and privilege and fix. Maybe you don't want things changing too much, so you want to fix some signs in terms of, you freeze them at certain times in meaning. And of course, if you look at all kinds of debates today, I'm not going to give examples because they're so hot and controversial, but think about it. Many certain signs that people used to regard as having a certain meaning, other people have come along and say, no, we want to open it up. And so is the opening something good or bad? Should things be fixed? But the attempt to try and close down and fix not just which signifiers are used, but what they actually mean, in this view, is an example of ideology. And of course, now, some people might say, that's not ideological. I'm not trying to shut down anybody. I'm basically just fixing these things because that's really what they do represent. So you can get all kinds of arguments about this. Okay, but if you take this line, this closure view, that ideology is fixing dominant signifiers of an otherwise free field, you're kind of in an ideological view, which Eagleton says, if you think about that, underneath this view that says this is what an ideology is this kind of latent, what he calls a latent libertarian view of the subject, right? And the person, right? We're subjects, right? And that it basically demonizes closure, right? Now, you might think, oh, well, wasn't closure bad, right? Well, so let's think about this. I might say something like, yes, it is ideological to fix certain terms and prioritize them and make other uses bad, etc., etc. You might say, yeah, I'm against that. But careful, says Eagleton. If you demonize any closure, think about what you're doing. He thinks that this demonizing of any closure, this is over the top. He says this is kind of like an anarchist view. Oh, any control is bad. No, you should just have signifiers and everything just go all over the place. Any control of them or closure or whatever is bad. He thinks that's a bit that is over the top. That's an anarchy, right? And so just to sort of, I think, to bring out what I think is kind of what's bugging Eagleton about this view. Sort of this, what is this exactly, this latent libertarian view, is that, that subjects should just be open to just anything, right? But if you think about it, when you think about something like creativity and freedom, right? Like if you just say, oh, there's no boundaries, just get rid of all boundaries and you'll have freedom and creativity. Well, I suppose you could say something like, if I just take my pen and go like this, yeah, you might say something like that little squiggle is a totally free act of creation. It's totally new. No one has exactly done that squiggle before. Sure, says Eagleton, you might say that, but is that really an interesting aspect of creativity? Is that an interesting expression of freedom? It's just randomness, right? It's just so anarchy, randomness, like just open play or whatever. Is this a work of art? You know, even if I draw a little frame or put it in a box or something, I don't think anyone would think so. If anyone wants to buy it for a lot of money, let me know. But I don't think I'm going to get any offers. Why? Because just unfettered expression is not terribly interesting. This is an old idea. Goes back to the ancients. You also find it in Whitehead. Creativity can't be purely unbounded. Whitehead, the great process thinker. You also find it in T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent. The individual, in order to truly produce something, has to work kind of within a tradition. The great iconoclast Einstein, people talk like that guy broke all the rules of physics. No, he did not. He worked within a lot of confines of 19th century physics, found problems with certain aspects of them, and opened them up in certain directions. But he also labored with a lot of work that was done by predecessors. So he doesn't just blow out of a vacuum and just come up with this wild new thing, relativity, which bears no resemblance to anything that physics had done before. That's kind of a myth, right? So structured closure and whatnot is not necessarily a bad thing. But remember, this view says, oh, all closure is bad. So Eagleton's saying, over the top, creativity, freedom, need boundaries, wild abandon doesn't create great art. It doesn't lead to social progress of any form either. Like wild abandon, like what are you talking about? That's anarchy. That's not a great thing. As a matter of fact, that could be bad. So he then gives a number of examples. And one is from a movement of the time, right? It's still around today, but it was the Take Back the Night movement. Well, that's a type of semiotic closure of those terms, right? It didn't just mean anything. And think of a lot of rhetorical devices and terms that we have today. They have definite meanings and they have definite power. To just say Take Back the Night, if you just sort of randomly think of what it might mean, it would lose its power. It has a very specific type of meaning, and that's what generates its power. And this semantic closure is what leads to the power. If it doesn't have any semantic semiotic or semantic closure, it becomes just a trivial type of phrase that may not have much meaning, or it might vary all over the place. No, it has a particular meaning. So think about notions of semiotic semantic closure as deriving some of their power through the closure. And if that's the case, then you shouldn't be demonizing all and any closure, says Eagleton. Okay. Anyways, there's more to say on that, but I think that gives you the flavor of why he's leery of this notion of ideology. Remember, we're still back in that notion of ideology may have a variety of ways, like a family resemblance concept. Go back to the previous video where I talked about family resemblance. Semiotic analysis, discourse analysis, just to go to the next kind of idea that Eagleton picks up here. It also helps guard against another thing of ideology's tendency to self-naturalization. Basically, what's ideological here is, it tends to present its own ideas and it tends to present its own sayings and things as natural, right? Naturalizing, it self-naturalizes. It's not a way of seeing the world. It is part of the world. It's a natural. If you must insist on ideology being a way of seeing the world, it's a natural way. It just stands to reason. And so a lot of the ideas that are in an ideological framework are self-naturalizing. They just present themselves as givens. Yes, it's always been that way. Maybe that's a way of seeing, but it's a natural way. It's not something that has a historical origin or a sociological background or explanation of why it comes to be. It just kind of is. Right? It's not another, lots of people would say something like, I don't hold a position amongst other positions. I hold a position and the others are just distortions and falsity, right? So in this view, ideology has a tendency to self-naturalization and place itself as a natural view. Okay, that's one way. So this self-naturalization, Roland Barthes says, Eagleton discusses a little bit of Barthes. Healthy signifiers, right? If we could use that term, they show their history, right? They don't try, the non-ideological type signifiers, they don't try and present themselves as natural. They try and present themselves with a bit sort of their historical product, right? That they are, or their historical background, that they're not naturalizing. They didn't just fall from heaven like manna, or they're not part of the natural world. They are social constructions. Those are healthy type. Unhealthy ones then hide their identity. They're sorry, not their identity, but their history. And this is all part of a notion of again, ideology. This whole thing, this seeing ideology as something that has a tendency to self-naturalize. Paul de Man, a literary critic, Eagleton says that that self-naturalization, yes, is the root of ideology, and this move of naturalizing language and the world are naturally linked. And Mann is a literary critic, so he questions, poets, that see somehow that language is like, a direct link into the heart of reality. Aristotle thought the Greek language like that. A big proponent of sort of this natural relationship of language and reality has to be someone like Heidegger, who, with his notion of the German language. I mean, he said language is the house of being, but largely it's the German language had a special kind of relationship to reality. But the main part, all the quibbles to the side, is that there is some kind of deep link between language and reality. And that somehow the notion of reality is tucked away, and we can find it by looking through language. Language and reality are sort of part of the same kind of thing. Language and the world, they're naturally linked. And that's how we can get at the world, is through language, right? This is sort of reminiscent, Eagleton doesn't bring it up, but the old philological view of that which was sort of a preceding discipline to English literature, as they, philological scholars had this sort of view that language had this really deep connection to the world. So when you would read, ancient poetry and medieval poetry, you're somehow getting a closer contact with the world before language somehow got separated from it. All right, so, but this view of ideology as a tendency to self-naturalization, that is a particular view of ideology, so that's why I put the little cross here in the circle. This whole way of seeing ideology is kind of restrictive. And Eagleton says, there are lots of other ways to see the notion of ideology, rather than just seeing it as this tendency to self-naturalization. And so seeing it as a tendency to self-naturalization is, shall we say, it's a dubious way to see the whole thing. Ideology does more than that. But so this idea of saying that ideology is, sort of saying that there is a disconnect in the world, but it's connected sort of through language, reestablished through language, and calling that ideology, that can be debated. Eagle is going to go on and discuss other takes on the language-reality relationship and how ideology plays a role in that. So he's going to look at it from a couple of different angles. But that's all I'm going to take. That's all I'm going to do in this video. We'll look at more of Eagleton's reflections on ideology in the next video. See you then.